Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know that schedules are tight, calendars are full, and I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. You've joined the summit to address unsheltered homelessness in Austin. First, I'd like to give a special thanks to our local and state elected officials who are here today. I'm Lynn Meredith, and I'm the chair of the, I'm Lynn Meredith, and I'm the chair of the Leadership Planning Group of the Summit to Address Unsheltered Homelessness in Austin. I want to let you know that the idea for the summit came when a group of us came together this fall to discuss what we could do to address the humanitarian crisis on the streets of our city of Austin. Laura Huffman, Bill Bryce, Mayor Adler, Lawton Cummings, DeWitt Pert, Steve Roberts, Matt Malika, and I agreed that the way forward was by developing a community action plan to coordinate and accelerate the response to the needs of those who are unsheltered in our population. From there, we convened a diverse group of 23 leaders from across the Austin community. These leaders informed and guided the work of the summit and will continue to do so for the next several months. I am so grateful to them for their dedication to this effort. The concept of a community action plan with a unified implementation strategy is a different approach for us in Austin. It's a way to significantly reduce the number of our neighbors who are unsheltered. At this summit, we are bringing together a comprehensive group of community advocates and community leaders, service providers, business groups, philanthropists, city leaders. We want everyone to come to an agreement and commit to a plan that will change the face of homelessness in Austin. We are very aware and we know that there are dedicated service providers, nonprofits, members of the faith community, city staff and leaders, and others doing good work here in Austin. But the impacts are currently not large enough and must be scaled and coordinated. The work of this summit will be to inventory resources, organize, and define what is working and what isn't working, to ensure that we have a structure in place that has the greatest impact on those living on our streets. The summit will not only establish what needs to be done immediately, but also over time, and it will detail the explicit responsibilities, timelines, and associated costs so that the community can hold all partners accountable for the outcomes that we need to get to net zero homelessness. Today, you'll learn more about how that work will be done over the next few weeks. And you'll also learn more about how the summit is structured. We have national and local experts and service providers currently working with the homeless population. You'll hear personal perspectives from those with lived experience. You will be provided with historical context and current data. You will also learn about factors contributing to someone experiencing homelessness, as well as common perceptions about our neighbors who are unsheltered. You may hear differences of opinion, but know that we all agree that those experiencing homelessness deserve an accelerated response, as living unsheltered should not be a human being's only option in Austin, Texas. If you have questions or input during today's session, we'll be monitoring the chat. The Q&A will allow you to ask questions anonymously. For the chat, you can choose to send your questions to the panelists only or to everyone. If we do not get to your question today, please email it to, and this will be put in the chat, summit@austinchamber.com. We'll get to it and we'll answer your questions. I'm going to turn this over to our next speaker, but I really want to frame this well. We did not get here overnight. So unsheltered homelessness won't go away overnight. However, right now, we have an opportunity to make a real change, and that is why we're all here today. Please give this your full attention and listen thoughtfully. I know you will learn a great deal. I know too that we can do this together through collaboration and acceleration of response. Thank you for being here. Kirk Watson, I want to introduce you. I don't know if everyone knows, but he's the current dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston. He's a former Texas state senator and a former mayor of Austin. During his tenure here, he worked tirelessly to address homelessness, including housing our homeless vets. Senator Watson, welcome.
Well, thank you, Lynn, and I appreciate both the introduction and your leadership on this issue. I also want to say thank you to the core leadership planning group for inviting me to participate in this. And I want to say thanks to all of the people that are on this Zoom call. All of you that are here virtually, they're wanting to be part of this plenary session and this summit. It's an impressive group. It's impressive in its diversity, its passion, and the ability to get things done. There are folks that I know will agree to different things, and there are folks in here that I know will disagree with certain things. But I have a great deal of confidence in the desire of this group to find good outcomes for people who are living in unsheltered homelessness and for the community as a whole. To me, the mission and work of addressing the issues involving people who are living homeless is among the most vital and moving that I've encountered since I entered public service. There's a lot that makes Austin special, but folks that are working to lift people out of living in unsheltered homelessness, people who seek to address the immediate need of someone living in those circumstances, well, they're a part of what makes Austin decent. My introduction to this mission started when I was first running for mayor. I remember campaigning in a downtown church and realizing I didn't really know anything substantive about the issue. I had a lot of emotion, I had lots of assumptions, and I had lots of opinions, but I didn't have enough real knowledge. After I took office, I was struck almost immediately by two things: the severity of the problem and the shocking inability or even refusal of so many people, including people I like and respect, to address the problem. We did a lot of work addressing needs of those living in unsheltered homelessness when I was mayor. I'm still proud of it. By seeking input from people with real experience, we shifted thinking and focused on the creation of a continuum of services. We built the Austin Resource Center for the homeless. We empowered and formed lasting partnerships with nonprofits and faith-based groups that did then and continue to do so much to address this daily tragedy. We made a multi-million-dollar infusion of funding for what was then known as Safe Place to assist women and children. And we beat back the strong, orchestrated, well-financed effort to sweep up the homeless and dump them in some part of the region where they could be, I guess, easily and guiltlessly ignored and forgotten. I was so moved that after I left the mayor's office, I asked to serve on the board of the Old Community Partnership for the Homeless. As a senator, I filed legislation to help our friends in need. I've raised money and I've been involved in other efforts. But was it all enough? Well, of course not. Obviously not. Not when you're dealing with something so basic and is at the core of human dignity. We all know this. We see the need every day in the faces of those on our streets and in our parks. In a community of enormous prosperity and wealth, so many people live in conditions devoid of basics. It's a blemish on the soul of the city, and it's just not right. I pray that as we look for a new direction, we'll each pause, realize our extraordinary circumstances, and have the empathy that we need to do what is right. So, how should we engage? How do we have a new direction or path forward on this seemingly intractable issue? Well, I'll submit to you that we must first have clarity of purpose. We must clearly, consistently, and continuously proclaim our purpose, why we seek our goals. It's not just enough to feel. And we can't let our work be distracted or tied up in the politics of Austin's latest fight of the week, the new issue of the month, or the political angst of the moment. Addressing the needs of our sisters and brothers living in unsheltered homelessness is a defining issue of our city, and it needs to be treated as such. In my view, our purpose has become badly overcomplicated and overpoliticized. We should all hang on, step back, no one proclaim victory, no one place blame. And I know there's a lot of legitimate emotion right now. But let me give one example. Addressing the needs of those living homeless isn't simply or just about decriminalizing homelessness. Now, I understand the appropriate intent behind that phrase. In fact, I've used it to explain my views. Unfortunately, though, the phrase decriminalizing homelessness is generically and poorly defined in Austin politics. It's sadly now not much more than a political term. And not always, but it's too often been weaponized and used to demean those who question approaches or reasoning. My point is that clarity of purpose requires focus and describes how what we say we need or want to do will get us there, each step of the way. And folks, there will be steps. It's okay for us to have an ultimate purpose, an ultimate mission, or an ultimate goal, even as we acknowledge that we need to address it in steps. We're not abandoning our purpose just because we can't solve it with one single action. It may take time. The steps may be needed to assure the dignity of our population living homeless as we pursue that ultimate outcome. In fact, why would we not have a short-term focus with a long-term vision? Why not ask, what can we be doing in the short term, right now, to enhance the lives of those living homeless, even as we work toward more permanent end results? What should we be doing right now, and are we doing all we can? Just because you adopt an interim, even stopgap solution doesn't mean you're abandoning the long-term, more permanent solution. In my view, we will damage, and actually I think we have, credibility if we make this an all or nothing proposition, or we're unclear in the purpose of each step. But clarity of purpose isn't enough. We must also have clarity of practice, which I define as nothing more complex than just getting it done, and getting it done openly, efficiently, and effectively. The truth is, simply caring, no matter how much you care, possessing the spiritual motivation, the positive intent, the respectful goals, it isn't enough. And it's not enough in this context, as we look for a new direction, to be holier than thou or the most politically correct. Because for all of that, Our practical response is what will actually define the humanity of our city. Let's consider a few principles today, and hopefully they'll be held as we go forward in this new direction. We shouldn't demand our concept of perfection. None of us have the perfect solution, be it for funding, assistance, or long-term happiness. I know some think they might. Okay, I know some who know they do. But let's just all hold that thought. As I've suggested when talking about clarity of purpose, we need to be transparent and honest about what we're trying to achieve and what we can achieve. We've seen what happens when people are unclear about the goals. They're less likely to support them. They're less likely to support the effort. So what are the practical goals? Well, I'll point out that I admit that I understand the concern I hear from people who struggle with the phrase ending homelessness. They don't believe we'll ever truly end it. Logically, it seems impossible, ridiculous to say that we will prevent every one of our vulnerable sisters and brothers from entering this abyss. Emotionally, it's discouraging to have an unachievable goal. Politically, it damages credibility. And I know we can explain what we mean by it. But as they say, when you're explaining, you're losing. So let's stop explaining. We need to simply, declaratively, and transparently describe our true goals, the realistic outcomes that we want people to rally around. What we're talking about, practically speaking, isn't ending homelessness, but solving it. Solving homelessness by providing a system of connected solutions. Solutions that make it as difficult as possible for vulnerable people to slip into the abyss, and when it happens, solutions that kick in immediately to pull them back out. We need solutions to improve conditions for people that are experiencing homelessness now and make that time brief, and solutions for keeping people from falling back in. We should look outside the traditional responses for these solutions, and we should know that the solutions to these solvable challenges will require facing serious structural flaws, including those involving very real issues of disparities and racial inequity in our system. One solution won't fit all, and we must engage groups we haven't before to advance equity. We also can't be paralyzed by a fear of failure. There will absolutely be mistakes made, and when they are, we all need to admit them, learn from them, and act again. Some will seek political gain from another's mistake, but we need to commit to avoiding that. And let's be willing to include everyone in the discussion. Let's create new and different constituencies beyond those who share our specific point of view. My friends, I believe we know the answer, even though we rarely think about it in basic terms. Our mission, both its purpose and in practice, providing solutions for those living in unsheltered homelessness, is inspiring in part because it invokes simple human dignity. Frankly, if that's where we always start, what will this do to provide dignity to an individual, and then dignity to that one, and then dignity to other individuals, and on, will be the city we want to be. Our solution for those living in unsheltered homelessness will be something the community can embrace. It will be the product of 1,000 mothers, the product of empathy for those we serve and each other. And I will tell you, I have confidence in all of us and in Austin, because I've seen us do big, difficult things. I have great hope for where we're headed. And now, as I kick this off, I'd like to turn it over to Sharonda Robinson, the president of Adisa Communications, to provide us with some more historical context before we move into the next portion of today's program, looking at our present situation. Sharonda, it's all yours.
Thank you, Senator and Dean Watson. It's so good to share this space with you. So the past is never dead. It's not even past. And so the issues that we're dealing with in this summit are issues that we have experienced over the history of this nation and of this state and of our city. And so as we begin to have a robust discussion about how we plan together, it's really important for us to understand the history around this issue and what those implications are for the decision making and the choices that this group will be making together in the coming weeks. And so to support that work and that discussion and that understanding, so that we can not only be action-oriented and proactive, but that we can also be reflective in our work so that we try as best we can, knowing that we are all human beings who have blind spots, who have been raised in a culture that tends to separate and denigrate people based on where they come from or how they look. We all experience those blind spots. We've tried to put together for you to support the conversations and the action planning and the work that this community must do together, a historical look at the issue. And so I've just placed in the chat for you a link to a tool that we shared with our leadership team as they met last week and asked them to do some reflective work. We're asking for you to do as well as you join into this conversation. It's austonsfuturestory.com, and I'm going to share it with you as we, just as a way for you to understand and know a little bit more about the history that myself and my team were able to research, and then to ask you to think about the implications of that history. So if you are taking a look at the website, we prepared a widget. We start in 1383, right? So a long time ago. And we go through 2021, actually last week of this year. And what we were able to do was pull out and put into this widget, if you will, this timeline, what we felt like were highlights. Now, what we have here is not the end all be all, and we definitely invite you to help us add to this and to grow our understanding, our collective and shared understanding of history and the story around homelessness in Austin and this country. But I wanted to, for the sake of invoking additional thinking and dialogue as we continue in this plenary and then into our action sessions, I wanted to highlight some things that I felt like may support this conversation. So I mentioned that we started in 1383, and I'm just going to scroll here to 1845. 1840, when the city of Austin was founded in 1839. When the city was founded, we were still in a state of dealing with slavery. Slavery was legal in this country. And Austin's population included 856 residents. 145 of them were enslaved Africans. In 1862 and 63, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and that's what you'll see here. One of the things I want to note is that if you are looking at the widget, this top level is just an excerpt of an article that is fully linked, so you can look at that. But in 1863, what the Emancipation Proclamation did for my ancestors was create homelessness, was create a lot of people who were unsheltered and unhoused in our communities across this country. And so the way that the city of Austin responded to that, and this is something that Stephen Brown talks about, who's a board member of ECHO, is that our Austin City Council met to determine what needed to be done, and that was in 1865, that's this entry here, what needed to be done with the influx of freed Africans who were coming to Austin because it was seen as a mecca, a place where people could have opportunity. And the decision that was made in that council meeting, and that conversation, was to criminalize vagrancy and criminalize homelessness, and use that as a way to further exploit people who were vulnerable. So in 1928, we know our history in Austin. The 1928 plan was the first master plan for the city, and it further segregated officially segregated our community. And what it did was create a place for the undesirables to go, the undesirables to live, and substandard housing, substandard infrastructure, all of those things. So just something, again, what are the implications of our past and our history and what that means for the decision-making that we're doing today? In 1985, so 1985 was the first homelessness task force for the city. And so you'll see that here we had reporters living on the street as part of their journalistic efforts, Molly Ivins as well. There was a camping ban that was passed about 11 years later. And again, that camping ban criminalized essentially vagrancy and panhandling, and that was in 1996. In 2007, we start to have broader community conversations around affordability and what it means to live in Austin, and how people who are living on the margins are more susceptible to becoming homeless because their wages are not keeping up with rents. And then in 2019, our council decriminalized homelessness, and that is the impetus for today's conversation, and the conversations that we're having, is that we actually as a community are seeing the real lived experience of people and what it looks like and what it feels like, and we're grappling with that. And so we definitely want to have you be thinking about all of these different points in history and all of these different ways that systems have responded to this issue. We want you to be thinking about what are the implications of that past history for the decision-making that we're doing today. I also want to note that in 2020, Austin hit a 10-year high in terms of homelessness. And so I'd love for, I know I've only got a few minutes left, and for some of you, this is the first opportunity that you've seen this particular timeline. I'm going to stop sharing, but would love for folks to put in the chat any feedback, any comments, any questions as we go, as I continue in these last few minutes about what you've seen, or maybe what's missing in that history, and how you might use this information to support the conversations and work that we're going to be doing together as a community. So I'll just wait just a moment, look at the chat. So I see Nellie Paulina Ramirez says, what I find striking is that previous surges in the unhoused population were tied to local economic downturns, whereas now, barring recent COVID surge, it's tied more to inequity as the city appears to be booming, right? What's the implication of that as we move forward in our decision-making and our action planning? Let's see. Anna Marie Price says, has the city become a destination for unsheltered residents? And that may be a question that we can answer as part of this, and what are the implications of that? I don't know if it's Cecil or Cecile. Cecil Domel says, this is really opening my eyes to see the history of homelessness and where it began. Thank you. You are so welcome for that. Again, we want this to be a tool for you to use. History always repeats itself unless we are intentional about how we may disrupt it, and the ways that we can use that history to inform our decision making is something that we invite all of us, invite you to as part of the Homelessness Summit. And so I will leave it at that and turn it over to our next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharonda. My name is Matthew Malika, the Executive Director with the Ending Community Homelessness Coalition, or ECHO. And I'm here today to present, to sort of level set, give a presentation on some local data and some local context on our population of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness here in Austin, Travis County. So I'm going to share my screen, start a presentation. Okay, so today we're going to go over three different buckets of topics here. We're going to look at socioeconomic conditions currently in Austin, Travis County that have led to, and will lead to higher rates of people experiencing homelessness. We're going to take a look at our current system and how it functions and what are some characteristics and performance metrics of the current system. And we're going to look at some characteristics and some demographics of our current population of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness here in Austin and Travis County. So right now we're gonna first look at some socioeconomic conditions, factors that influence homelessness here in Austin. So average rent here in the city, as you can see, from 2014 on, we are seeing a booming rental market here in the private market. We have rents going from a little over $1,200 per month all the way up to over $1,500 per month here in 2021, with a slight downturn from 2020 to 2021. But as you can see here, the minimum wage worker would have to work 125 hours a week to afford a one-bedroom apartment here in Austin, Travis County. This next slide shows the percent of extremely low income renter households in Austin, Travis County as compared to other large metro cities in Texas and to the state as a whole. Right now you can see that people that make 30% or less of the average median income pay more than 50% of their income to housing and utilities here in Austin. Right now, Texas has the 6th highest percentage of severe housing cost burdens in the nation. And there are pretty much 23 homes for every 100 extremely cost burdened households in Austin, Travis County. And right now, we know based on the pandemic and what COVID has done to our economy, it's having a disproportionate impact here on our low wage workers. So as you can see, an employment rate for low wage workers has plummeted more than 30% since the start of the pandemic. People experiencing homelessness that have an income make an average of $13,175 annually. But it's also really important to mention here that 52% of people experiencing homelessness, unsheltered homelessness, do not have income currently. So just by way of comparison for this chart, it's important to mention that our high wage workers, and those are those characterized as above 60K, have only seen an employment drop by about 1.3% in the same time frame. So right now we're seeing a disproportionate impact on our extremely low income earners, and that's going to have an impact moving forward on Austinites here. These are folks in our city and in our county who will be exposed potentially or on the precipice of needing some support, or will potentially experience homelessness if not for some support or change in affordability here in Austin. So we're going to transition here to system outcomes and performance. So this is, how is our homeless response system currently operating? What are some of the things that it's doing well? What are some of the things it needs improvement on? So here we're going to take a look at program enrollments. Total enrollments in different types of housing interventions that our plenary or that our affinity groups will be doing work in over the next week and a half. So as you can see here, and this is from our homeless management information system, the total program enrollments in 2020 for street outreach, coordinated entry, day shelter, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, all these different housing interventions for people experiencing homelessness that you can see, and then how it relates in 2020. These are enrollments that were only from the year 2020. And as you can see, you know, a couple of things to highlight here. Our permanent supportive housing enrollments. So the permanent supportive housing is an intervention that allows for people to stay in their housing for as long as they need to be in housing. It's a permanent intervention with rental assistance, help paying the rent, and supportive services like behavioral health, primary care, and mental health treatment for folks in the home. We had 68 new enrollments in 2020. What does that mean? You know, that means that we have permanent supportive housing programs that are doing their job. They're keeping people in housing. They're keeping folks stably housed, but that we're not increasing the supply of permanent supportive housing at the rate that we need to in order to catch up with the demand here in Austin, Travis County. Another thing worth mentioning with this slide is that overall, we've seen a decrease in emergency shelter use. That's an important thing to mention here. So, you know, in 2020, as the pandemic made congregate shelter space unsafe for many people experiencing homelessness initially until protocols were in place and CDC guidance was able to be followed, we saw a decrease in the number of folks accessing emergency shelter, which means we saw an increase in folks experiencing unsheltered homelessness in our community. So this chart talks about how do people access housing in our system? How does it work? So we have permanent housing programs here in the middle, and we have unsheltered and sheltered homelessness, and then folks coming from institutional settings. So from maybe state hospital settings, or, you know, ASH could be one area and one example of that. We have folks going into permanent housing. We see that in our permanent housing programs, the sheltered community is coming in at 47%, and the unsheltered community is coming in at about 49%. And we see that our programs are leading to, 73% that come into our permanent housing programs exit those programs to permanent housing. So we're creating some capacity in that space of folks coming in and exiting to other permanent housing destinations. We see that our communities, some folks are moving to temporary housing, and some folks do end up experiencing homelessness after their stint in permanent housing. We also just want to I want to hit on here very quickly to Sharonda's point in her presentation that we see our Black African American population return to homelessness through our programs more often and more quickly than our white or Hispanic Latinx populations. That's a really important designation. In fact, 11.7% of our Black African American exits return to homelessness within 1 year, and that is higher than the 9.5% of white non-Hispanics that exit permanent housing to homelessness. When Sharonda gave the presentation about how do we create an equitable response, how do we look at our history and ensure that moving forward we're closing the gaps on those inequities, this is one area of improvement for our system. So here's people housed by quarter and project type. So we're just going to look at this very quickly. What this is telling us is that in 2020, our partners, our service provider partners, many of whom are on the call, housed 1,879 people in that year, an increase of 8% from the year before. That is in the middle of a pandemic. That is remarkable, and I think something from our system perspective that should be celebrated. It needs to be higher. It needs to be more. There needs to be a sense of urgency around increasing that number. And when you look at people housed by project type, you see here that we have most folks in our programs are accessing what's called a rapid rehousing intervention, which is a short-term rental assistance intervention with supportive services meant to move people through the homeless response system into a permanent housing exit and on into a stable unit where they rent on their own. We see the permanent supportive housing line, that blue line, being a lot smaller of an area of need in our community. And we see what's called minimal housing assistance, which is someone came into our system very quickly, needed maybe just 1 month's rent or a security deposit in order to access the rental unit on their own. And then the graph on the right, or the chart on the right, breaks those clients housed by race and ethnicity down. It's showing that we are making strides toward addressing the inequities in our system with the Black African-American population, but we have a long ways to go. And also that when broken out, the non-Hispanic white population and the Hispanic Latino population is running at sort of a similar size and flow across the last 7 or 8 quarters. Lastly, I want to get to presenting on characteristics of our population of people experiencing homelessness in Austin, Travis County. So when we look at our unsheltered population, who are they, and what are some of their demographic, what's their demographic makeup, and who are they? So here we see head of household by gender, size of household, and age. You can see that predominantly male, and for household size, we have a very large percentage of our population are single adults. For age distribution, you'll see that number on the right there of the mean age of 40 years old of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness in our community. And I want to mention that we're basing this number on a most recent poll of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness in our HMIS database. That number is 2,134 people, and we believe that that's the most accurate number to date of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness in our community, and that makes up about 1,525 households. This is a breakdown of those households by race and ethnicity on the left, and a shot of the Travis County population on the right. Again, this is data is current and up to date as of 2021. As you can see, the breakdown of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness on the left, Travis County population on the right. Disproportionate number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness are Black as relates to the population. And as you can see, all of those indicators across the board. Lastly, just a little bit about our subpopulations of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness in our community. We found that 83% of those people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, or 81%, I apologize, identify as having a disabling condition. 38% are experiencing what we call chronic homelessness, which means that they've experienced homelessness for a significant amount of time, and they've been homeless in our community for longer than most people. We see that 14% are families of children, 13% unaccompanied youth, and 7% veterans. And remember, this is amongst our population of unsheltered homelessness in our community. So I wanted to use that my time, to provide a snapshot of data of our current population, some socioeconomic conditions that are leading to homelessness in our community and that could potentially lead to more homelessness in our community, and also look at how our system's performing, realizing that there are things that we need to do better and some things that we are doing well, and also the client characteristics of our population. And at this point, I'm gonna segue to a video and put a face to some of this data, and as we move on through our program and into our next session. So if we could put the video up, that'd be great.
Well, I never thought it would happen to me. I have a college degree. I worked in accounting and auditing for years, You get behind on your payments, next thing you know, you're in foreclosure. Next thing you know, Out on the street, you got all your furniture sitting on the side of the road.
The people on the side of the road that you see, they're not just these creatures that live on the side of the road. They're just people, and they have real problems, and those problems have led them into this situation.
They're our neighbors. They're like our family.
Can I ask you how long you've been out here?
Good on the streets?
Yeah.
33 years.
33 years?
I raised myself since I was 12. I raised 5 kids, put them all through college. And now I'm trying to do me.
I was a professional for 25 years. I never missed a day of work. I went to college, got degrees.
Grew up in Austin, have no kids, never been married. Came homeless about 2 years ago.
There's like real people with real life problems that happen so fast, you know, back to back, like life altering events that happen so fast that, you know, I couldn't keep up, you know. It's like, okay, now what? It was so much easier to get in this hole than it is getting out of it.
Don't ever think that it can't happen to you, because it can happen to anybody.
Go talk to a person and get to know them and walk with them for a year. And you'll see a complete change in your perspective on homelessness. You'll understand it differently.
It's not a walk in the park, it's hard. You know what I'm saying?
If you're a female, it's harder.
They can go work their 9 to 5 and go home. This is our 9 to 5, this is our home.
It's almost impossible to keep a job when you're homeless. You take a bird bath in a public restroom or whatever, and then have to go to work and be presentable.
You know, everyone wants to be happy. Everyone wants a life that they feel good about, that's worth living.
I like to be just like everybody else, you know? A working class citizen, trying to make a better life for himself.
I don't want to live here for the rest of my life. I just need a couple of steps. Just help me get to A and B, and I can do C and D.
You can only go up from here, from your bottom, so.
Thank you. So I think it's clear when looking at and hearing that video that people experiencing homelessness know what it takes and are the best experts in there to understand how we can end homelessness in our community. I want to welcome a couple panelists now. The first is Lyric Wardlow, who works in partnership with a wide variety of organizations to end homelessness around the country and here in Austin, Travis County. And we're truly lucky to have Lyric in our community and fighting this battle with us to end homelessness and end unsheltered homelessness. I also want to welcome Kiana Fisher, who has experience as a service provider with many organizations across the community, and is currently working with Texas Homeless Network to find solutions to end homelessness across our state. Kiana, welcome. And of course, I want to welcome back Senator Watson, who's going to moderate the panel. Senator, thank you for your time and your passion for the cause.
Thank you. And thank Lyric and Kiana. I look forward to this discussion that we're going to have. And let me just start off, because we all know that there are a lot of misconceptions about why people experience or find themselves living homeless, and why it's so hard for someone to end that situation. Both of you have different experiences within the homeless response system, let's call it. Lyric, let me start with you. Without touching on anything that you wouldn't like to share, can you discuss and tell us a little bit about the barriers that you've come across in the journey that's led you here?
So I'm not going to experience or speak on my experiences, not just for myself, but my mom as well. And so when I was a kid, I experienced homelessness under the protection of my mom. And so when I was living in shelters from 9 until pretty older in my teens, that was due to my mom's own inability to sustain housing. And so I always questioned, and I was having a conversation with a friend of mine the other day about why she couldn't fix it. Like, why couldn't she just get her stuff together to get us into housing? And I never understood until my grandmother passed away, the conversation that we once had, but she told me, she was like, Lyric, your mom has always struggled with certain things, and she's always struggled with the complexity of social standards that we have in society of having a home and having these responsibilities and being able to maintain certain standards of living. She was never able to really grip that. And I always resented my mom when I was younger of like, why were we homeless and why couldn't you get your stuff together? I moved to Austin 8 years ago with her when I was about 15 years old. And we stayed in a motel thinking, once we got here, we had packed up all our stuff from where we were from in Indiana, took all our stuff and said, we're just going to move to Austin, Texas. We just chose it because my name's Lyric. She loves music. It just went 2 and 2. And so we moved here and thought, okay, we're going to start a whole new life. We had come from homelessness in Indiana and thought like, we're going to make it here. And immediately ran into the 3 times rent and the deposit and all that stuff. And in a smaller area in Indiana, that wasn't something that was a huge barrier, and we could stay with friends. And even though we were homeless, we knew how to work our way around our city. And then moved to Austin and figured out there were so many complex barriers that she was not going to be able to address by herself. And so after staying in the Motel 6 for as long as she could with her disability money, she's permanently disabled, we couldn't stay there any longer. Like it wasn't working. And we moved into the Salvation Army downtown, and I asked my mom, can you promise me my 16th birthday is not going to be in this shelter? Just promise me this. And she promised, and she said, we're not going to be here by next year. I promise, Lyric, we're going to get out of here. And my 16th birthday came around and I was still in that shelter. And the resentment came up of, why are you doing this to me? Why can't you just get housing? And then when I finally moved out at 18, we had got some housing after a year staying in that shelter downtown and seeing the way the arch was, and me going to school at a very Austin High, which is it's a super high-end school for high education youth. I realized once I turned 18 and moved on my own, it is not that easy. And that even at a starting level of 18 years old, getting into housing was almost impossible for me with the credit checks and the deposits. And it's just not affordable for anyone in this day and age. And so I realized that my mom wasn't just making things up. And I feel as though the community oftentimes feels as though people should just get their stuff together. It's easy enough, but it's not. And there are other things, there's so many reasons, and there should never be a simple reason as to why someone's homeless, because that's not how it works. But it shouldn't just be the community saying, this is just something that they need to figure out on their own, or the city is responsible for fixing it on their own, or the service providers are responsible for doing it on their own. It is every single piece of the community, the culture in which we have this city itself, like the community. When I stayed at the Salvation Army, ACL happened, South by Southwest happened. And I realized super quickly that like, it wasn't just the shelter that was housing us that wasn't, helping my mom in the best way. And it wasn't the city also that was super like, it's all of their fault. It was everything, because I saw the way in which on Christmas Day in the shelter, I knew all of my friends from school were having these big, nice Christmas parties, and no one showed up at the shelter to give out Christmas gifts to the kids in that shelter. And no one cooked a Christmas meal in that shelter. I realized that it wasn't just the shelter itself, but it was the community, the culture in which we see people experiencing homelessness, and the city itself. It's all of us that have to come together and provide a solution and really start to get away from it's their fault, or they need to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, because there are real barriers that are financial, as well as mental, as well as physical, all kinds of things that get in the way. And we have to start shifting from that in every way we can. So.
Great. That's a powerful answer. Thank you for that. And Kiana, before I come to you, I want to remind all the folks that are a part of this today, this plenary session, please keep your questions coming in the chat, or you can feel free to email your questions to summit@austinchamber.com. And what we're going to do is we're going to capture all those questions and comments today, and we'll respond to them and provide it back to the group. So Kiana, following up that very powerful answer by Lyric, I want to ask you, you're a former case manager. and you're a performance coordinator for the Texas Homeless Network. So let me ask you, when you're working now at the systems level, what are some of the factors that you are seeing in the systems that complicate this process?
Thank you so much for that question. And Lyric, thank you for sharing your story. I think it's one of the things that I think about is I believe that ending homelessness is completely possible if we do it as a community. One of the biggest misconceptions that I think people have about people experiencing homelessness in our community is that we're not responsible. I'm here to tell you that those people that live in our community that we see on the streets, those are our neighbors. I was raised here in Austin, and in the last 8 years that I've been working in homeless services, I have worked with people that I went to high school with. I've worked with people that I have worshiped with, and I have worked with people that are actively employed in our community that we see every day. If there is an idea that these are not our people, I want to challenge that idea. I think what we have to do is reconnect people to community. Reconnecting to community is one of the best ways to end a family's episode of homelessness, not only for an acute crisis situation, but for good.
And say, go a little deeper on that. When you say connect to the community, give an example of what you're talking about.
Absolutely. So when I worked as a case manager and I was looking to reconnect someone to community, absolutely, we need a housing unit, right? They need a housing unit that is affordable, that is safe, that they can feel comfortable with their kids coming and their grandparents visiting them. But more than that, they're also going to need a place to buy groceries and that place is welcoming to them. And they're going to need a faith home. And they're going to need maybe some parks or walking trails so that they can enjoy and start to feel integrated back into the community. A community center where they can connect to a food pantry or some recreational activities. Or even like a volunteer, connect to a volunteer opportunities. So when I say integrate back into communities, I'm not just talking about having a unit to live in, but really being welcomed back into community.
I appreciate that answer. Let me ask both of you, and either one of you can jump in first on this, but I'd like to hear from both of you. We heard Sharonda's powerful presentation on historical inequities, and in my opening comments, one of the things I said was we're going to have to look at some real structural issues that we have with disparities and inequities. Can y'all comment on that? Can you tell us how this translates to what we're seeing in Austin right now from your two very important perspectives? Lyric, you want to start?
Yeah, I can go. I think it's pretty obvious to me when I moved to this city that there was an obvious segregation of communities happening in Austin, specifically talking about the West Side versus the East Side, and just the way in which that vibe is just very real for me. But I mean, even public transportation doesn't go very far into West Austin. And so I, like myself, I live in Pflugerville now because I could not afford to stay in Central Austin any longer. And my mom is living in permanent housing that is not the best due to, I mean, I don't want to blame it on people or systems or anything like that, but I mean, it's very obvious when she received her housing that she was placed in an area that was fitting to her color and her race, just her income, all of those things. And it's not a you cannot be optimistic and be moving towards a good future when you're placed in a situation where the population that is supposed to be directly supported isn't being done that way. And I think anyone that comes into the city and sees that and sees the segregation between the city of Austin has to acknowledge that at all times. So,
Kiana, you want to comment on that?
Absolutely. The data shows that Black people are 4.8 times more likely to be homeless than our white neighbors. Structural racism is absolutely a leading cause of homelessness in our community. We have to be willing to change the systematic racism within our systems. Service providers have to be allowed to get away from just providing predetermined service packages that are predetermined by funders, and they have to be encouraged to do individualized treatment plans that are going to recognize that the person or the household that's experiencing homelessness, they're the expert on their experience and their challenges and their strengths. And we have to also look towards community and how do we engage communities of color to ensure that we're doing that reintegration appropriately.
Larry, did you want to add something to that? Did you raise your hand to say something?
Scratching my head, you're good.
Okay, sorry about that. It's hard to tell on Zoom. Well, let me ask you a question, and we've just got a couple more minutes for this panel discussion. But let me ask you a question from your perspective. Help us, if you could do one thing, and that's an unfair question, I know. But what would be the thing that you would most like this group that is caring enough to be a part of this conversation and looking for a new direction? What would be the thing that you would advise us we should do?
I can answer. So I think, knowledge is power. And if we do not all know and understand the system that is serving the people experiencing homelessness, then how can you have an opinion or a stake in this conversation? If you do not know what's actually happening behind the scenes, or if you've not had active involvement in what is going on, then that is what I require of the people listening in, is that you completely understand or try to attempt to understand what's really happening in the behind the scenes, or just the knowledge that you need to know to show up in this space and hear what I'm saying right now when it comes to people experiencing homelessness. Because if you don't understand what service providers provide what services, then how can you come into this space and complain about what someone is doing or what someone else isn't doing? Because you should have that common knowledge. And I expect that from everyone.
Good answer, Kiana, and one that we should all pay attention to as we judge the role we want to play in this. So thank you, Kiana. Let me ask you that question. If you could give us one bit of advice, what would that be?
Yeah, I think we have to start to improve our systems by recognizing that we are not the experts. We need to recognize that the people experiencing homelessness, they are the experts in their experience, and they can tell us a lot about how to navigate our system. Which things in our system are cumbersome and frugal and need to be gotten away with, and what service packages we need to be providing. And I think the last thing that we need to do is we need to actively outreach to leaders in communities of color for partnership, for collaboration, and for feedback.
Well, I appreciate, and I know everybody that's paying attention to this, both Lyric and Kiana, thank you very much. We really do appreciate your insight and ability to help us as we try to do right by the individuals in our community and the community as a whole. So God bless you and thank you. And with that, I'm now going to introduce someone who is a national expert in not only addressing the issues related to homelessness, but in achieving solutions through a collaborative approach, and that's Barb Poppy. Barb served as the executive director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, where she not only developed and launched the first ever federal strategic plan to end homelessness, but also she oversaw the implementation of the plan and the execution of the strategies that achieve significant measurable results. So with that, I turn it over to you, Barb. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you all today. I'm going to just start by saying it's been an honor to be a part of the work in Austin for over a year now. And I'm going to share with you my thoughts as I have traveled across the country and worked in many states and many local governments and communities about what it takes to really move toward an end on sheltered homelessness. And you'll notice the slide graphic I've chosen is about the puzzle pieces and emphasizing the importance of partnership. All themes I think you've heard, and it's important to bring those pieces together. So if we can go on to the next slide. So the first section I'm going to talk about is grounding you in what works. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what we found through some research that I did in your community and the implications of national best practices being implemented in the work that you're doing here in the city of Austin. So next slide. So first of all, the big headline that I need everyone to take away from today's conversation is that the lack of housing causes homelessness. And there have been two recent studies, one published in February of 2021 and another a year ago, right before the pandemic. And in both of those, they looked across America and they said, why are rates of homelessness and unsheltered homelessness different in different markets? And one study found that homelessness rises faster where rent exceeds a third of income. And what that means, if you're a high cost community where it's very expensive to rent an apartment in, you will have faster rising rates of homelessness than if you're in a community where the rent is not taking up as much of a share of people's income. The second study looked at housing market conditions, but it also looked at rates of poverty and mental illness and drug use and other factors that are commonly associated with causes of homelessness. And what this study found was that when it looked at the rates of homelessness across a range of geographies, the thing that explained it wasn't poverty rates, it wasn't the rate of mental illness. In fact, it was the housing market conditions. And so that explained fully why Seattle, which has a much higher per capita rate of homelessness than Chicago. So this drives us back to understanding, as you look at where you are in Austin, that it is the housing and the lack of that access to affordable housing that is really driving the rates of homelessness in your community, which are much higher than many of your peers across the state and across the country. Next slide. About a year ago, with Dr. Steve Matro from the University of Delaware, we published a report called Research and Results. And we did this under contract with the Laura and John Arnold Foundation based out of Houston, but it also recently rebranded as Arnold Ventures. And what Steve and I did is we spent about a year and a half looking at communities and data and trying to really understand what were the solutions to unsheltered homelessness that were working and gaining progress and traction, and offered to communities real practical guidance on what is needed to address unsheltered homelessness. So I'm going to share with you in the next few slides just a few of the lessons that we learned in that research that we did. Next slide. So as we studied communities that were making progress on reducing unsheltered homelessness or had effectively eliminated it, what we discovered is there was work being done in four component areas. The first is communities had taken up the cause of trying to figure out why people were falling into homelessness, and then looking to find out what could be done to reduce that inflow into homelessness. And they found, as you look at your data, that people are coming into homelessness through your housing affordability system and eviction courts and the justice system and anti-poverty programs aren't sufficient to stave off poverty. And the child welfare system also is a place where, unfortunately, many young people age out of foster care into homelessness. So communities need to look at, in one part is, why are people coming into homelessness, and what can we do in those public systems to get them to reduce that inflow? The center two puzzle pieces are what makes up your homelessness assistance system. And that is the network of agencies that have been organized to both provide a crisis response, outreach, and emergency shelter and day centers, as well as the housing stabilization, which is to help people exit homelessness as quickly as possible. And in your community, that homeless assistance system is led by Austin Public Health in partnership with ECHO and the Continuum of Care. And then you have a full range of providers that have been engaged in working together to respond to the crisis, as well as to help people exit to homelessness. And a well-functioning homeless assistance system is critical. It can't compensate, though, if there's more inflow happening than they are scaled to be able to handle. The fourth puzzle piece is that when communities don't have enough places for people to come inside, and people have to live outside in these public spaces, there has to be an active effort to manage these public spaces in ways that are inclusive and are not non-punitive. And this requires really a broad coalition that is working to make the spaces be able to be used by those who have to live in them as people experiencing homelessness, but also people who are in the neighborhoods or in the business districts. And so managing these in a way that makes the spaces health and safe for all. You don't want to overinvest in public space management as instead of investing in your homeless assistance system, but you also can't ignore it, because sometimes what people feel are most frustrated about is the fact that trash is building up, or they feel that people shouldn't have to urinate or defecate outside because they don't have access to a restroom. So thinking through those public space strategies is important. Next slide. The evidence-based approach that has been proven across the country is called Housing First. And Housing First is an approach that is focused on stabilizing people in housing as quickly as possible. And it is not an approach that is housing without services, but it is an approach that says housing is the most important. And as we provide those services, it makes a difference. And there's a substantial body of evidence that Housing First is the most effective response to homelessness. Next slide. There are other practices that are undergirded by Housing First. And in your community, you have many of these practices underway, but it's important to really think comprehensively about the network and how agencies are implementing, say, permanent supportive housing with fidelity to the Housing First model. And so this gets a little geeky in here, but it's to say there's a lot of documented practices that can be done in communities that make a huge difference. Next slide. The next two slides that I'm going to talk with you about are ones that really look at this issue of maximizing utilization and flow. And this is a situation where if we look on the left side of the screen, this is an unbalanced community. This community has really focused on building shelter beds rather than having housing placements. And typically their shelter beds only turn over twice a year. People are spending about 6 months in those. And what you can see happens is because they don't have adequate housing placements, the shelters become full, and then there's an overflow onto the streets. So without having a place for people to flow into housing, you back up. Whereas if you look on the right side, this is a community that did develop emergency shelter beds, but they turn over more quickly. And they optimally, you're seeing 5 permanent housing placements annually for every shelter bed. The consequence of that is those beds are maximally used, they turn over, so they're effective and they're efficient, and you'll have fewer people staying on the streets if you maximize your flow by having the right amount of housing placement so that people don't get backed up in shelter or flow into the streets. The next slide. Another way that communities can get caught up is they can not offer any direct entries from the street and mandate that everyone who wants a housing placement has to come into shelter. And then what you see happens when they don't have enough housing placements is people fall back into it. And again, we have this kind of backing up phenomena. The most efficient way to deal with unsheltered homelessness is to place them directly from the streets into apartments. And this has been done across the country. In Matt's presentation, he demonstrated that well over half of the placements in your community are coming directly from the streets. What needs to happen is to scale that up so that those are happening at a rate that is sufficient to match the number of people who are unsheltered in your community. Next slide. As we close out our research that we did for the Arnold Ventures Foundation, we really looked into the punitive approaches as to what the impacts were on those and whether they actually were effective. And we started out this research really being open to what worked. And what we discovered as we delved into this is that punitive approaches have far more harm than you might originally think is possible. Is that being punitive and moving people along actually contributes to longer lengths of time homeless because it triggers humiliation and anger, further destitution. They lose their belongings every time they move. They become traumatized by this. There is oftentimes physical harm because they're moved into areas that are less safe. And then they also get arrested or get fines or warrants. And with that, they're even more difficult to house. So we found consistently that punitive approaches were not effective at addressing homelessness. Next slide. About a year ago, my company was engaged to look by the city of Austin to look at how you were investing resources to address homelessness. And we did a 9-month study from January through September. And also in that time, the pandemic got a chance to support that. And we published a report in July of 2020 that represented the recommendations of my firm. Next slide. So one of the first things that we found was that the approach to homelessness in Austin was fairly fragmented, and it was really like this bowl of spaghetti on the left side. And what we recommended was that there be a stronger collaboration that was unified around a proactive purpose, having a seamless systems management approach, and then also unifying. And in doing that, in your community, there are 2 primary lead agencies. One is the city of Austin, because it's the strongest investor in programs to address homelessness and also controls a lot of the policies that address homelessness. And second, the ECHO, which manages the coordinated entry system, HMIS, and is responsible under their HUD roles for a lot of the planning that goes on. Next slide. Toward that end, in our report, we recommended that there be a collaborative system strategy that aligned all of the components and the funding. What we found is too often funding requirements were cross purposes to best practices, and there wasn't strong alignment for services with housing. We also did not observe that there was action-oriented management. It's a rather passive response to homelessness because all the partners aren't aligned and moving in an action-oriented way. And I'll just say, this is one of the reasons I am so excited that Mandy is working in your community with her colleagues at Clutch Consulting, because the action-oriented approach is going to can make a huge difference in communities. There also needs to be proactive communication and a leadership that is really focused on the solutions. There are 100 million different reasons you can't solve homelessness. But what we need are leaders that actually are looking for those solutions. Next slide. And so the core of our recommendations were to have your community move to a housing-focused, person-centered, and I want to say that's what Kiana was talking about, is this has to be a person-centered approach. It's not a cookie-cutter program model. It really is person-centered that leans into the assets that each individual brings to this. And that it's really important to use trauma-informed care with harm reduction approaches. Programmatic, strict guidelines and such are counter to the best practices. And what needs to happen is your crisis response, which includes your outreach, your day centers, and then also as you're moving to more non-congregate rather than congregate shelter, we believe you'll see better results as well. That's being proven across the country in the pandemic. And you've been at the forefront of communities really using non-congregate shelter through hotel conversions. And that is got to lean into the work to help people avoid homelessness, be rapidly rehoused through rapid rehousing, developing more permanent supportive housing. You have one of the lowest supply of permanent supportive housing that I've seen in communities across the country. And then really building up your stock of affordable rental housing, both by making rental assistance available, but also by increasing the supply that is targeted to the lowest income households, those households at or below 30% of area median income or the poverty level. Next slide. So we were asked to just give kind of where should you start, because there are so many needs. You were a community that was under-resourced in most areas. You were under-resourced in your housing responses, both permanent supportive housing as well as rapid rehousing, but you also didn't have a lot of effective prevention and diversion going on. And clearly there was a shortage of some capacity. So what we recommended is that a modest expansion goal should be by next July to bring on additional resources to do more of the diversion rapid results, add some shelter capacity, and really increase dramatically your permanent housing solutions. The price tag for doing that, we costed that based on your actual costs in Austin, and that was estimated to be an additional investment just shy of $20 million. Now, this is a modest increase. It is not the sufficiency of what's needed to scale to completely solve homelessness, but it would make some measurable impacts in your community. And I think you are at a juncture where you can really make the kind of investment in housing that will make a huge impact. And I think we found that the data would support that from the extensive analysis that my team did. Next slide. So wanted to leave you with all of the resources. I think as Lyric said, really getting knowledgeable about the issue and what is happening in your community, but also being aware of the resources that are available and what lessons have been learned in other communities is incredibly important. So you'll have access to this as well after the presentation. And I think that you're going to get me out of my slide deck. I think that's the end of it. Great. So at this time, I am really privileged to honor my good colleague, Mandy Chapman Semple. She hails from Houston. I first came across Mandy's work when I was at the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness in the Obama administration. And we found just the amazing work that was going on in Houston in terms of their efforts to reduce chronic and veterans homelessness. And I got to meet Mandy in that role. But since she's become a colleague in the consulting world, and I have admired the work that she's recently been doing in Los Angeles and Chicago, we partnered up on a small amount of work in Seattle. So it's always good to get to work with Mandy. She really can lead your community into action-oriented solutions that can rapidly rehouse people. And that, as I leave, I want to say that is the most important takeaway from today, is it is possible to reduce unsheltered homelessness. It will require deliberate action, and it does require moving together. It won't be perfect, but perfect is the enemy of the good. And in your community, you have enough goodwill that I hope you can proceed and really benefit from the work that Mandy's going to do. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mandy.
Thank you, Barb. It was a very generous introduction. I'm really delighted to be supporting Austin in this process today. And my portion of today's presentation is simply as a facilitator for the summit to offer you a preview of how the summit process will evolve over the next few weeks. As I've assisted communities across the country to transform their homelessness response systems, I can attest to the significance of this particular moment. It is this moment that a community pivots from managing homelessness to solving it. And I think Sarah's going to bring up a slide here behind me that will go into more depth here about the summit. So this pivotal summit has come together with the goal of developing an implementation strategy to effectively and significantly reduce unsheltered homelessness in Austin. It is important to acknowledge that this is not the first time this has been a goal that's been of interest in this community, but it is the first time the community is coming together with arms locked and are committed to developing a unified, comprehensive, shared vision for addressing unsheltered homelessness across Austin. That is what makes this moment different and powerful. The objectives of the summit reflect this level of leadership commitment and include the creation of an implementation and investment plan, as well as implementation and oversight structures that will ensure rapid and effective execution. Central to this process is a core leadership group who's committed to and capable of clearing the runway for the implementers. So we will accomplish these objectives using a series of plenary sessions and targeted planning sessions that take place over the next few weeks. It will start with assembling a core leadership group made up of diverse stakeholders from a variety of spheres of influence, each bringing distinct perspective and shared concern and compassion for eliminating homelessness and a willingness to work together. This is where we will begin to build a shared vision and clarity of charge. Next, we've come together with all of you to level set and ensure we're all starting from the same shared understanding of homelessness, how we got to this moment in Austin, and what local and national data can tell us about how to respond to unsheltered homelessness in a dignified and effective manner, while also building a more equitable response system along the way to avoid repeating history. With this shared understanding and clarity of charge, we will engage with small affinity groups comprised of local experts representing various components of the homelessness response system, and fully consider all of the actions and investments necessary to execute on this ambitious charge. It is from these sessions that detailed implementation plans will be produced. Following the affinity sessions, all plans will be synthesized and organized to support execution. We will engage with ECHO and the City of Austin to assemble a joint implementation team, consider roles and assignments to support execution, train staff, and prepare dashboards and reports to ensure transparency and accountability for the process ahead. Finally, all of these items will be assembled and presented back to the core leadership group for final consideration, including a proposed investment plan. This session will affirm the leadership group's commitment to fund and support execution of the plan. It will include clear timelines and milestones for shifting both the visible nature and actual numbers of individuals experiencing unsheltered homelessness. It is then that we will bring this plan to you in a future plenary session. This session will allow everyone to fully engage and embrace the core leadership group and their commitments, align activities and investments, and serve as ambassadors for the action plan to address unsheltered homelessness. So it's with a renewed spirit to help move Austin forward together that I now ask all of the on-screen participants in today's session to unmute for a broad question and answer before we wrap up the session today.
Mandy, thank you for that. And I'm going to try to moderate this discussion a little bit and ask a couple of questions and try to get some feedback from all of you in one way or another. But the first question that I've got is something I ended with a few minutes ago with that excellent panel we had with Lyric and Kiana, because I asked those two to help me with, if you could say one most impactful thing, something to that effect that we can do to address this issue, give us that big piece of advice, what would it be? And I now want to kind of put that out to the rest of you. Matt, I'm going to put you on the spot and start with you, but what is the single most impactful thing that you would suggest we could do to reverse the trajectory of unsheltered homelessness that we have in Austin?
Yeah, thanks, Senator Watson. I think it really does start with having a community plan that we're driving towards and investing in and implementing in our community, and that strategy here that we're embarking on today, and that we'll be taking on over the next month. That's going to include a lot of different factors. That's going to include, scaling up different parts of the system that was mentioned earlier. That's going to include having a racial equity focus on the work and understanding that housing, we only end homelessness through a housing justice lens, and ensuring that folks have access to quality, affordable housing and healthcare. And so I think the pivotal moment is when the community is all driving in one direction and investing and implementing a plan that has, strategy and coordination associated with it. And I think that this plenary session is the start of that process. My hope is that, what we come out of the affinity groups, that work that's happening in the affinity groups, when Mandy brings it together and we come back to this group and present you all with something that really resonates with Austin and with Austinites here, and that's something that everyone can attach to and move forward together on.
How about other of our experts and panelists that are here? Feel free to Diana, do you have anything that you would add about what you would suggest is the single most impactful thing?
Yes, Senator, thank you. I'm happy to be here. There are perhaps two things in one sentence. We need scale and we need speed. So we need to come to scale, and the speed is not just about coming to scale quickly, but it's about thinking about moving people out of homelessness quickly. The longer you're homeless, the harder it is to become rehoused. So we really need to develop a system that can address people's homelessness before all of those barriers build upon themselves and make it that much harder for them to become rehoused.
Others? Mandy, you look like you want to say something.
I do. Diana has me really excited with that comment. In my experience in communities across the country, when a community started to embrace that mentality that Diana just described, how do we move people out of homelessness as quickly as possible? And how do we appreciate that we start with people who have been experiencing homelessness the longest in our community by creating a big surge, by putting a big down payment into that rehousing system that you need to build? That's when you start to see some of the most dramatic results in communities. And the sooner Austin can embrace this idea of surging in your community to respond immediately to the unsheltered crisis, the sooner you can begin to build a balanced homelessness response system, and you can start to make investments, smaller investments, more strategic investments in some of those other strategies, low-cost strategies that will ultimately keep your system in balance ongoing. But you have to make that down payment to get yourself out of the unfortunate hole that exists that folks have fallen into.
Are there others that want to comment on that? Let me ask a question that I think is a part of what we're talking about here, but it's a question that we got from in the chat room that I think plays to this idea of what is one of the most impactful things that we can do. And I'm not prejudging it. I just want to read the question exactly as it's written and get this group of experts' responses. But it said, and this person says, just to clarify, unsheltered homelessness has doubled in Austin while sheltered has dropped, and overall numbers have increased by around 30%. And then the question is, doesn't that show that we need some shelter beds as opposed to doubling permanent supportive housing beds with ever increasing numbers on the street? What's the reaction some of you have to something like that question? Yes, somebody's hand went up. Barbara,
Great.
Your hand went up and then you jumped on my Zoom screen. So there you are, I got you.
Thank you. I think that's a great question. And we did in our report recommend a modest increase in emergency shelter beds. And just to say, there is a cost to adding emergency shelter beds, and it does relieve some human suffering. If you're not commensurately building the housing options for people to leave through rental assistance, through the rapid rehousing or the permanent supportive housing, those beds quickly become filled. I hail from Columbus, Ohio, and I was the head of the Community Shelter Board here, which is a partnership. And our founder quickly came to the conclusion, and this is back in the 1980s, and he said that building shelter is a black hole because there isn't a way out for people. And so just investing in shelter is not going to be sufficient to solve the problem. I mean, just think about in the chat, they were saying there's as many as 5,000 to 10,000 people. That putting those people in a shelter bed when the next person who flows into homelessness because they get evicted, because they lose their job, because other things happen. So you can't just build shelter. That's why we made a recommendation for a modest increase in shelter, but importantly, to really scale up and ramp up the housing through rental assistance and quick rehousing placement assistance, and to really make a difference in that way, because then it becomes sustainable. And as my graph showed, you can move people through, but without housing, it just doesn't get you to where you need to be.
Others have comments on that? Let me ask another question. And again, I'm going to pitch it out to the group, and anybody ought to feel free to jump in here. And that is, and it's been suggested a little bit, Barbara suggested it in some of her comments, but what are other communities, what are we seeing in other communities right here in Texas where at least the perception is that they're making progress at a time when maybe Austin's not making progress? I know that I hear that perception from folks, but what have we seen them doing in other communities? And what is the community that you would highlight as a best practice and what they did? And I'll say that part of that question comes from somebody earlier asking a question in the chat room. Somebody have an answer that they want to start with?
So she may not speak up by her lonesome, but I'm going to point to Mandy Chapman Semple, who helped lead some of the really important efforts in Houston that had a very measurable impact on homelessness there.
All right, well, Mandy, Diana's pointed that right at you. Go ahead.
So certainly Houston made those early investments, that down payment that I described in rehousing activities. So Houston added more than 2,500 units of permanent supportive housing over just a few years, and have continued to do so. They've added thousands of units of rapid rehousing into their system. And with, for example, all of the success that they've seen as part of the larger CARES Act and COVID response strategies, they were able to commit to housing another 5,000 individuals over the course of 2 years who are experiencing homelessness in order to reduce the continued spread of infectious disease and respond to people's very legitimate need for housing as a public health service and support. So these are just incredible examples of when you can start to build the rehousing muscles of your system, you can, begin to very successfully move a large number of people into housing and keep them in that housing while also having enough resource to be then responsive to individuals who are starting to experience homelessness for the first time, right? Or housing instability for the first time. And Houston's well positioned. Houston now is also starting to target unsheltered homelessness in its totality by going systematically to each encampment and offering every individual the ability to move into housing directly from that encampment. And that is making a tremendous difference in the ability for that community to then be responsive to public space management in a really compassionate and successful way. So the timeline that it took for Houston to get to this particular point where they're on the verge of ending chronic and unsheltered homelessness, in the fourth largest city in the country, it took about 7 years with a focused, steady commitment and focused, steady investment to achieve the scale that Diana is describing. And it was leveraged each and every time as a crisis emerged. So for example, when Hurricane Harvey hit Houston and we had thousands of people in disaster emergency shelters, the immediate response on the part of the mayor was to activate that rehousing system. And they rehoused over 800 people in 46 days back into apartments in that community and helped those individuals stabilize and avoid ending up homeless as a result of the disaster. So I just think the benefits of a rehousing system, as evidenced by Houston and so many other communities, but Houston in Texas in particular, it has benefits that go far beyond ending homelessness or solving for homelessness, but in fact, really becoming an essential safety net and tool in your community to respond to people in crisis.
Okay, and let me, and maybe you said it and I just missed it, but if I did, I want to emphasize it by this question. And that is by making, and I asked the question, you know, where should we be looking for other communities? But by making that comparison, what role does the housing market in Houston versus Austin, what role does the housing market play in the scenario that you just outlined as a form of best practice? And also, I guess, you know, Houston is famously known for not having zoning. What role does that play?
I really appreciate you asking that question. So first, I want to say, as lovely as it is not to have zoning, it still takes years to develop housing in Houston, just like anywhere else. But the commitment of the collective to make that combination of investments that allowed for both development of new units of housing, but also access and conversion of units in the market became critical to our success. So it was a combination of both of those features. The other piece that has been replicated across the country in a variety of markets, so Los Angeles is a great example, is when you start to think at scale, you start to negotiate within the rental market very differently. And you can create incentive structures that allow you to compete to acquire those units much more successfully than if I'm a case manager taking an individual client to convince an individual landlord to rent to my client. And employing those types of systems thinking practices and thinking and operating at scale has allowed us to engage in even the tightest of markets to compete for a unit availability because we can create a financial incentive to do so. And it doesn't become about being charitable, but instead it makes economic sense to help support individuals living successfully in your community and in housing. So while Houston had great success in helping to pioneer some of these models at scale, they have been replicated, they have been tested in all sorts of markets. So it's not that Houston was special because its market was super accessible. We had to do the work to penetrate that market just like any other community. And the difference, I would say, in a community like Austin or in Los Angeles or Seattle is that the public-private partnership that's going to be necessary to influence that market is probably going to be greater the tighter the market, because you've got to think both from a policy perspective and from a funding perspective to make those incentives possible.
Other comment? Thank you for that. Are there other thoughts about things that are happening in other communities that we ought to be looking at as best practices or trying to replicate?
Yeah, I'd love to answer.
Please. Yeah, Larry, please.
So I think very like small scale as a person with lived expertise. Like when I was experiencing homelessness, or even now when I pass through downtown Austin, like what do I think would really make a difference, not on a big scale, but just really meaningful to people experiencing homelessness. And so some of the things that I've seen right now are like the purple trash cans that are being posted up downtown, like, and the bathroom, the porta potties and that kind of stuff. Like I wish and feel as though something that would be good for the community is making that a permanent thing in Austin, not for just the homeless community, but people who are going in downtown Austin and visiting, and having something nice and permanent for the community to have of like, this is something that we feel is necessary and needed. And even when we do have a low rate of homelessness in Austin, that's something that's still there for the community that lives downtown. I've seen when I've gone to conferences, I haven't done a lot of stuff out of Texas, but when I've gone to other places, I've seen that they do stuff like that, where they have permanent bathrooms, they have like trash bins in there that are for needles and that kind of stuff. There's blue light so that if you need to see your veins, like you can't do that. They really think innovatively about the things that they're doing for the community downtown or in the spaces where they have a high population of people, to really kind of think about how to support them, having permanent water fountains, not just placing trash cans, but actually supporting that community in the best way they can. When 911 comes in or when the police come in, they have someone with mental health services come along with them if they know it's a person experiencing homelessness, because that is something that if someone needs support and the police are someone that someone has a trigger and trauma with, then they have someone who is trained to help support them in that circumstance. And so I think that's something that I've seen other communities do that Austin can do a lot better when helping people experiencing homelessness. So it's the small things that we can really do to make an impact.
Thanks for that. Anybody else want to comment on that?
I could jump in here real quick and just to say, you are at a historic opportunity where there have never been more federal resources coming to provide rental assistance, as well as capital development dollars and emergency housing vouchers. And so I, in some ways, envy the role that you have, because the federal government has never given you so many tools that you could mobilize so quickly to address homelessness. And there is ample guidance from the federal government that it is important to really focus on unsheltered homelessness and establishing that as your priority. And so I really hope, I hope you're not going to squander those resources, because it is historic amounts of funding. And I am seeing in other communities that they are thinking about, how do we use these dollars to transform lives that are on the streets, but also how do we transform our systems? How do we create new housing stock as quickly as possible? And using emergency orders, there are ways people are, waiving normal development. There's a lot of creative work happening across the country to permanently transform communities using these new federal dollars. So I really hope that's the kind of thinking you have in place, because I know we're in a pandemic. I know we're in a recession. Times are really hard, but you've got access to resources that were never available at any time in my lifetime. So think well, do well, act well.
There's real opportunity. Mandy, I want to come back to you on Houston real quick, because that's the city that's getting talked about the most really right now. And one of the questions that someone put in the chat room, and you may not know the answer to this, but has there been savings with regard to healthcare and the criminal justice system due to the housing ramp up in Houston?
Yeah, it's a great question. So early on in the process, Houston was able to benefit from the statewide 1115 Medicaid waiver that to help fund some of the supportive services in permanent supportive housing. And as part of that, there were studies done looking at in particular, the health cost savings for individuals who were chronically homeless and also frequent users of the emergency room. And what they found is that over the course of 2 years, you start to see pretty dramatic savings by shifting from a crisis response healthcare modality to a prevention-oriented healthcare modality. So where people are getting preventative care. And so that evidence base has prompted many managed care providers in Texas to become advocates for funding supportive housing services because they see and have been able to model that when you put an individual on that type of preventative health trajectory versus a crisis response trajectory, not only do we see cost savings in the 2 years that we're providing the supportive housing to them, but the lifetime of cost savings definitely adds up. And we had some similar success with responding to individuals who were frequent users of jail, but I don't have as much evaluative evidence to offer you on the exact cost savings. But we certainly saw success with those individuals remaining stably housed.
That's great. I appreciate your answering that question. Matt, were you getting ready to say something?
Yeah, and I would just like to mention that we've seen similar efforts here in Austin, Travis County that show the same results. And there's a report on ECHO's website that talks about the healthcare and criminal justice system and savings that have gone into housing those folks through what's called the at-home initiative or Pay for Success project. Also worth mentioning the Terrace at Oak Springs, which is a permanent supportive housing complex created by Integral Care, has a great report out that shows the impact of the work that's happened there from both a physical health perspective, a criminal justice involvement perspective, a behavioral health perspective. It's very clear that pre and post housing and services, community-based services, that folks get better, they get well in those units and with access to that care.
Well, I'm going to ask the panel of experts if there's anything that you want to add to this discussion that I haven't asked you. We're right at the end of our allotted time. We're going to, as we promised, keep everybody on schedule. So we'll end this on schedule. But before I shut it down, I guess, I'll ask, is there anybody that wants to say something about the questions that have been asked or about where we are in this process? And then we'll let people go back to the rest of their evening. In fact, it may be happy hour for a lot of folks, and I'm not going to interrupt that. Does anybody want to add anything?
I think there's one.
Yes, please.
One thing I'd like to comment on that I don't know that we fully answered as one of those questions, and there was a question in the chat related to a correlation between investment in permanent supportive housing and seeing an increase in homelessness over the same kind of time of investment. And I just want to reiterate that if you go back to the evidence base that Barb presented, that the lack of affordable housing across a community, across an entire market, is the driver. It's false to correlate modest investment in permanent supportive housing creation and an increase in homelessness with an increase in homelessness. So it's really important to understand that what Diana described as, we need to think about scale. We need to think about reversing or changing the market conditions that are driving individuals into homelessness. And so this idea that if we invest in permanent housing and not in emergency shelter, that we're going to see an increase in homelessness, I just want to make sure that everyone understands there is no evidence that supports that correlation whatsoever. All of the evidence from across the country points to an investment in rehousing strategies and putting people back into our community with decent places to live. That is the promised land. That is healthy, balanced communities. And that's how we start to see dramatic shifts in our communities as well. So I just want to put a finer point on that, because I think it will become central to the action plan that's developed.
Thank you for that. And with that, I'm going to say thank you again to the leadership group that invited me to get to be a part of play a small role in this today in the plenary session. And folks, this is just the plenary session. As has been pointed out by Mandy in her presentation, and as she just suggested in her closing comments there, work goes on, and it's going to be a facilitated effort to get us into a plan where, as I indicated at the very beginning of this day, we will hopefully as a community come up with a system of solutions for homelessness and how we address it going forward. So Lynn Meredith, I'm going to pitch it back to you, and thank you again for letting me be a small part of this.
Thank you, Senator Watson. It has been an exciting, informative 2 hours here, and I so appreciate everyone. I just want to call out that there are some people who have been in the background just helping put this together. From the chamber, we have Jeremy Martin and Colleen. We so appreciate the effort, Carleen Pate, the effort that you put into this. Like Barb, Diana, Matt, Mandy, wow, Sharonda, it's amazing. Lyric, Kiana, wow, Diana, thank you. So much information, so many data points, so many opportunities to change the trajectory of what's going on here in Austin. Great information that was posted in the chat, fabulous questions. I just want to set expectations. The recording will be available. We will get it to you. We have your email because you sent us your RSVP, so we have your email. So we will send something out to tell you how you can view this recording. The answers to the questions that have not been answered publicly in the chat will be answered. So not to worry about that. Again, we have your emails, so we will get to that. For those of you who are concerned that we haven't been broad enough, they haven't included enough people, we hear you. This is a beginning. We have not started perfectly. We have started. We have begun. We will become much more inclusive as we go forward. So I want you to know that. It's going to take all of us. This is a great community. We have to come together around the solutions to unsheltered homelessness. This is not about the city. It's not about ECHO. It's not about the chamber or the business community, the faith community. It's about all of us. It must take all of us. We have to hold hands. We have to get together, and we have to do this. So thank you. And we'll see you on the next video. Bye-bye.